record on this computer. Okay. Hi, Jennifer. Hi, Bill. How are
Hello,
you guys?
Will.
How you doing?
Very good.
I'm going to let Facebook find us and let people know that we are here. So I'm going to fill a little bit of time for those of you that are used to coming to Warwick's events on Facebook. You're probably tired of hearing me say some of this stuff, but for some new people that we might have watching, I need to do my PSA for Warwick's. So for those of you that don't know, Warwick's is located in San Diego, La Jolla, and Jennifer, can you still hear me?
I can. Yep.
Okay, good. Because you guys froze on my screen a little bit, but now you're back. So I just wanted to make sure you guys could still hear me and that everything was still working. La Jolla, San Diego, like I say, that anywhere that there is to get a book, you can get it from Warwick. So online, call us. We've been in business since 1896. We're not the oldest bookstore in the country, but we're the oldest continuously family owned. So we have been in La Jolla since the 30s, in the building we're at since the 50s. So we are a legacy store here in San Diego. So if you're in the area, come by and see us. Since the COVID shutdown, we did open about 8 weeks after the shutdown when the governor allowed retail to open back up again. So we're doing masks, social distancing. So there's nothing better than coming and browsing books. So that's always an option for you. And Jennifer, I know you've heard this and I'm sure other people have, but we're in a voting season. And I always like to say that not only do you cast your votes for political reasons, but your dollars are casting votes too. So I know we're in a pandemic, I know we're in a financial crisis, but buying books and buying authors' books that you like is really important. It's a way of letting publishers and everybody know that you like that author and that you want to see and hear from them again. They're providing entertainment and knowledge, and we need to support the art. So yes, I'm a bookseller, but also want to support authors that, you know, we want to have back bringing us great books. So we're here tonight with the wonderful Bill Clegg. We are, yep, we'll both hold it up. Hopefully this will be a screenshot at some point, right? Jennifer and Bill are going to talk for about 35-40 minutes. I will be putting in the chat function how to buy the book from Warwick, so there'll be a link to do that. If you want to join the conversation, put your questions in there and I'll be bringing those to them at the end of their conversation. So with that, I will stop chattering and we'll get the evening going. So Jeniffer Thompson is a personal branding expert, digital marketing strategist, and host of the Premise podcast. And these events also get featured onto the Premise podcast too later on. So there's always something to, if you need something to listen to, if you come in late or anything. She's an author and speaker who delivers strategy-rich content and actionable tools that educate and empower authors. She and her husband, Chad, co-founded Monkey See Media in 2004 and have been creating award-winning book cover design and author websites ever since. Jennifer is co-founder of the San Diego Writers Festival. She serves on the board of the San Diego Memoir Writers Association and is currently writing her own coming-of-age memoir. And like I said the other night, she's going to be on the other side of this couch one of these days. So, so with that, you two have a great conversation and we'll see you afterwards.
Thank you so much, Julie. Well, this is a real honor and a pleasure to be here with Bill Clegg. This book is amazing. Bill Clegg is a literary agent in New York and the author of the best-selling memoirs Portrait of an Addict as a Young Man and 90 Days. His first novel, Did You Ever Have a Family?, hit the New York Times bestseller list and was longlisted for the National Book Award, Man Booker Prize, Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, and Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence. Bill has also written for the New York Times, Lapham's Quarterly, New York Magazine, The Guardian, and Harper's Bazaar. Bill, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is awesome. This is a fantastic book. I want to hold it up again, and I'll do this again throughout our interview today. The end of the day takes place during the course of one long day, interwoven with the flashbacks of several characters, all revealing alternate points of view, some of which contradict one another, which makes this plot and this assembly of unlikely characters all that more delicious. The end of the day is ultimately about our need to have meaning and our never-ending quest to find happiness and the American dream. Your first book, which I mentioned, Did You Ever Have a Family?, explores themes of forgiveness. Whereas this book, The End of the Day, is almost the opposite, where the characters all have their own version of the truth and secrets that may or may not be revealed. Was your intention to explore a theme that seemingly contradicts the idea of forgiveness, the idea that maybe sometimes the truth is not what we need to save ourselves and each other? Or was this book more about the idea of forgiving oneself?
Hmm. You know, it's I don't want to give anything away, but I do think in some ways, yes, like there was a maybe initially an unconscious response to kind of what unfolds and what kind of sits at the thematic center of Did You Ever Have a Family? And in this there is a desire for absolution from some characters, and as I was writing it, I kind of became presented with the choice really to sort of see if some people would be absolved, and if kind of illuminating one side of a story or explaining the circumstance of certain actions that had happened a long time ago, causes for certain actions, reasons, if illuminating those would precipitate absolution. And I don't think I should say.
Yeah, you can't give it away. Yeah.
But I will say that I was interested in also kind of what happens to some people when on the other side of not being absolved, and when you're really just left with yourself and you're left with kind of taking stock of your own choices and making peace with that. And so I think probably this book is in many ways about making peace with certain choices, and I guess forgiving oneself and moving on away from painful consequences for things that we've done and said and choices that we've made. So and also how like choices that might seem sort of small in youth or in young adulthood, how it's kind of only after a long period of time that we see that that they've actually shaped our whole lives. There's certain choices that we make when we're young, that we're just not aware of the consequences, or not even aware of really the stakes. It's sort of the tension between children and parents a lot of the times, because I think parents try and drill down, like, the choices you make now will determine your life and
affect the rest of your life. Yeah.
And you can't know that as a young person, I don't think.
I think it's also interesting because, these characters are deeply affected by the choices of others, that they had no say in, they had no idea was happening. And, when we take stock of our lives and we look at like the trajectory, sometimes it has nothing to do with us. And I think in a lot of ways, this book really looks at that and kind of gives us, you talk about, being absolved, like to just live your life and rest in who you are and where you have come to in your life, and being okay with that and finding happiness, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this period of time that we're in right now, illuminates probably, at least in my life, more than any other time, how, we're being moved like pieces on a chessboard at this point. Like, it's like, you will not go to your office every day. You will not go to school. You have to teach school, even though it's
right.
And so a lot of, so what we're bumping into now is really an illumination of like kind of the levels of agency and power that people have over their lives. And, some people can remove themselves from dangerous situations with regard to COVID, and other people can't. They have to go to work, and so in the book, for different, there's different shaping circumstances, much more personal and not pandemical, like or global,
right.
where that do illuminate as well, like the kind of disparity of agency and the disparity of power in people's lives, and so that was also something that I was interested in. I was not thinking about a pandemic at the time in any way, though.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
the
was.
disparity, I think that's, one of my favorite parts of the book is these characters range from, an immigrant family, a Mexican family, who they're just trying to get in the American dream and, just get into America legally, right? And then we've got this family who is so well off that they really just don't understand. They could never understand what it means to struggle like that. And they're interwoven really well. I want to talk about my favorite character to love and hate in the end of the day. Dana Goss. Is it Goss or Goss?
Goss.
Goss. Okay. I
Yeah.
meant to ask you before. Dana Goss, because she's the most complicated and probably the most unhappy and unfulfilled, even though she's also the most privileged. Was there a character in the end of the day you enjoyed writing more than the others?
There were times, it really changed over the course of the writing of the book. Dana, I had a lot of compassion for her. I have known versions of Dana in my life, both young and older, but also just how, we were talking before about how, depending on kind of levels of power and agency, we have, a commensurate number of choices that we can make. Jackie, who's a character in the book who, has, she grows up in a working class family. She's provided for. Compared to some characters, she's privileged.
Yeah.
But compared to Dana, for example, her choices are far more limited, and she looks at those choices very early on, and she has a keen sense of sort of like what path she can take, and so she decides on a path very early, and sort of make sure that she is able to follow it. She wants to stay in the town that she grew up in. She wants to be married. She wants to have a child. Or children. And she wants all that to happen very soon after high school, because she doesn't want to leave it to chance. And so she's working under the assumption that she doesn't actually have a lot of choices to make.
Right.
And so she doubles down on that and does whatever she has to do to make it happen. And there's consequences for that willfulness, I think. And but then you have, and her life has lots of ups and downs, but I think there's a certain level of peace that she makes with it. I think that she does attain a kind of happiness, for lack of a better word, and fulfillment. And whereas Dana, who has basically her options are limitless, still constrained. She's still a woman. This is still like the 1960s. So there are definitely barriers for her too, even though she's educated and moneyed and all these things. But beyond that, there's an enormous amount of choice. And what you see with that in her life is that she never actually makes a choice. She just she'll move on, and I know I've known these people, and so in some ways it's a curse, because if we're uncomfortable in our lives, we have to kind of make it work. You know what I mean? At least, I do. I shouldn't make assumptions about other people, but you figure it out, you make it work. In her life, it's she will, buys a house, renovates it, meets people in La Jolla. She actually lives in La Jolla for a while. But when it gets complicated or uncomfortable, instead of working it out, she just leaves. She just moves on to some other community. Some friend is in Paris. She goes there for a while. And that happens for a long period of time, until she sort of ends up back in New York, and pretty much alone.
Yeah.
And only left with kind of the consequences of all those choices that she's made.
Yeah. She's alienated herself from everyone around her in a way. There's a scene in the book where Dana has this epiphany of sorts. She'd always judged her grandfather for flaunting his wealth. He builds this amazing estate for this young, beautiful bride who doesn't return his love. And Dana feels a shift in her feelings toward her grandfather. And she's older. I think she's in her 60s. And she decides that she admires him for doing what he needed to get what he wanted. You know, he didn't die with regrets, she says to herself. Can you talk about the importance of that scene and this idea of living with regret?
I think, you know, for her, you know, she, the other person in her life who kind of did what it took to get what she wanted, was Jackie. You know, it's like she sets her sights on Floyd in high school, and she does what it takes to marry him. And so it was intended to be a very subtle parallel in terms of, you know, they're very different characters. Jackie, you know, in the 1960s, and Dana's great grandfather in the 1800s, but she'd always had contempt for him, and but then I think now, kind of on the other side, like in her late 60s, alone, having never really made a choice about anyone or anything or anywhere, like she admires that, like, he went for it. It might have, like, there might, you know, he even died for it. I mean, because he ends up in the Civil War to prove his sort of masculinity to this woman who doesn't love him but is marrying him for the money. And so I think she's through her grandfather, she's able to admire Jackie for, in some way, who she'd had contempt for. In this area of her life, she had contempt for her choice of Floyd. Floyd wasn't good enough for Dana. But then I think the other thing underneath that is that Dana also had, like, very strong feelings for Jackie. I think they were incredibly close friends. I think that there was also more to it for Dana. I think there was a romantic feeling there, and but it was the 1960s. You know, certainly in that small town, which is modeled on the town that I grew up in the northwest corner of Connecticut. Like, I didn't know any out gay people in my high school or in the town, adults or like adolescents, and that was, I grew up in the 1980s there, 70s, 80s, and then I graduated from college in the early 90s. And so they were in the 1950s and 60s. Right. And so I didn't live there then, but I can pretty much guarantee that in that world, like, being gay was just not even, it just didn't bubble to the consciousness. It didn't bubble to my consciousness. And I'm out and gay for over 25 years now. And it was really not something that was in view in any way there. But so I think for her, she did have feelings for Jackie that she sublimated and legislated and acted on in all sorts of ways that, like, really set the course for kind of a lot of what happens in the book. So I think she looks at her grandfather and she looks at Jackie now, and they both took risks. They both took actions to secure something that they wanted. And whether that's good or bad, you know, sort of empirically, she now sees it as something that, like, she didn't do. And so I think that regret for her, in terms of, like, she loved Jackie, and she, you know, even though she probably knows it never could have manifested in anything, because I think Jackie didn't have romantic feelings for Dana. But the actions that she took around, that came from sublimating that love, I think ended up with them being estranged for all of their adult lives. So I think that's when she sees her grandfather, it sort of, it opens up a kind of an awareness of how the distance between her choices and Jackie and somebody like her grandfather.
Did you know this relationship when you were writing these characters, the grandfather and Jackie? Was that, you know, in your mind from the very beginning, or was that something that developed over time in writing the book?
Yeah, it sort of developed over time. I mean, like, you know, I can't remember the phrase that I used, but it was like sort of like the you know, she's a great beauty and he's a wimpy rich kid. Like, I remember like that dynamic, I remember like describing that painting, and
Yeah.
and the kind of the disparity there, and seeing it through Dana's eyes. And I wrote a lot of that backstory before making the connection to Jackie, and so it was only later. But then I kind of saw the opportunity, and that's what led to Dana's kind of reverie, like looking at it and having a shift in the way that she perceives her grandfather.
Would you like to read that scene?
I can try.
175 or 177. Actually, 177 might be a great place to start, beginning with the second paragraph on that page.
Sure. Like beginning with "Good for you, George."
No, I was thinking at the top, a car door slams outside, and bringing it down to "Good for you, George."
Got it. A car door slams outside. Dana barely hears it. She looks up at George's flimsy frame and dark eyes and recognizes something else there. Why it makes her feel strangely relieved, she does not know. He was led by his heart, she thinks defensively, made a spectacle of his love, sacrificed everything, and when he died, he had no regrets. She scans Olivia's pale features. Even from where she sits, she can appreciate how delicately painted and lifelike Olivia's slender neck and décolletage are. What a pair, Dana thinks, and sees the once upon a time Willings as both doomed and oddly heroic. Two children of a new century born with assets and liabilities, one money, the other beauty, and in not so original an equation, they each used what they had like weapons and bagged big game. She looks at them standing side by side, the river behind them. Olivia's hands are folded tidily below the high cinched waist of her gown, George's left hand on her far shoulder, his right on the one that seems to pull away from him. He is holding her not like a trophy or a possession, or even the way Dana has seen most husbands touch their wives with affection. He is holding her like someone who must, someone who accepts his wife, forgives her for despising him even, who would fight for her, whose fate is bound to hers beyond the point of choice. He loves her. When that might have happened, no one will ever know. But by the time this painting was created, according to her grandmother soon after they'd married, he was already determined to do whatever it took to be in her company, make her happy and win her love. Good for you, George, Dana whispers.
The writing in this book is so fantastic. I loved reading this book. And from the very beginning, I was drawn into the characters. I will say there was one point where I was a little mad at you. Part 2, we're dropped into a new character in a new place and time. And I was like, wait a minute, you can't leave me hanging. But I knew I had to trust you and keep going. But you use this technique in the book, which creates beautiful and delicious tension where the same character is hanging in space. So we might have a character in one scene, at the end of the chapter, and then that same character again in another scene at a different point in their life. And we don't know how they're all going to tie together. It was an interesting technique. And I wonder how you came to use this. Was it intentional? This idea of placing people at different pivotal points in the realization of, for the readers, we're like, oh, wait a minute, this character's been left here in a reality that's actually not true. So talk to me about this technique and, the pacing that you chose for this book.
Well, that sort of method I had used in my first novel, Did You Ever Have a Family? And there were more characters in that book. I mean, there were characters who sort of make one appearance or a couple of appearances, and for that book, that scene that worked for me. It's it's really just how the story kind of occurs to me. It's the doorway for this book was Jackie, and she is the mother of a minor character in Did You Ever Have a Family? She makes a brief appearance toward the beginning of the book, and my intention was just for her to sort of make this appearance. She stands at her son's car. She sort of grieves with him for a moment, and then you move on, and you don't really see this character again. And yet there was just something about her, this woman in her late 60s in her house coat and her porch light is on in the middle of the day, and I just I don't know
There
what
was
it was.
more.
I just kind of kept on thinking about her. And so while I was writing Did You Ever Have a Family, I ended up going sort of into her life more. And it became clear that she was not going to be part of that novel, like, because this whole other kind of universe was hatching around her. And so during the period of writing that book, I just kind of would, I would jump into the document that held the writing around her whenever I would hit a wall in Did You Ever Have a Family? And when you write like this, you paint yourself into corners like a little bit. Like there may be one streak of a story that you really get committed to, but it might not like allow you to do what you thought you were going to do over here with this character. It's a complicated kind of puzzle, and which actually is part of what thrills me about it too, is because I also, I'm just jumping around a little bit, but if you sit and talk to somebody for long enough, like the twists and turns of somebody's life often are so much more interesting and surprising than your first impression. And I think so much of our lives, particularly now with like social media and we really like, and to lesser and greater degrees. And we make these decisions about people. We kind of these assumptions. Some of those assumptions turn out to be deadly, as we have seen in the case of like George Floyd, and assumptions that cause fear-based actions. And so I think it's something human that's in us to do this, and I think it then gets either calcified into things like racism or classism or sexism. There's all sorts of ways in which like our preconceived notions about people shape the way we interact with them. And so in terms of like these lives that I've kind of presented, like I kind of like writing them was sort of like having a long conversation with them, which is like, you meet them in their late 60s, these three women who are really at the center of the book. And I guess I wanted, like, for Jackie especially, like this woman who seems like she has had like a very mild life, like a former secretary at the elementary school. Like this is all we kind of know about her. And yet, like, there are moments in her life that are wildly dramatic, and it was rich and epic, and there was a whole opera of a life that precedes like this period of time where she's very much alone and in an empty house with two kids who've grown up. But the way those lives intersect, I think, is why I like having a structure that moves from one character to the next. And I also like being able to kind of paint the parallels between lives that wouldn't necessarily look like they would have much in common. And I think by doing that, it allows certain things to certain characters and experiences that from a distance look extremely different actually have a lot in common, and which I think is also always somehow a surprise to people. It's like, oh, this very wealthy person who had unlimited choices like could have a feeling that was very close to the one that I had, so I think that's that process of kind of discovering those connections is also why I like that structure.
I mean, was that your intention, is to show that, hey, we're all the same? I mean, at the end of the day, regardless of our socioeconomic position in our life, like we're really all the same. We want the same things, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think with both novels, like that is one of the it's one of the beating hearts of like what's up in them, like, and what I like to illuminate. And it's not that I set out to like create like this, this person over here and this person over here. How can I? What happens is they become real people to me, and in the telling of their stories, I can then begin to recognize and make those connections, and then shape the writing and the story around that a little bit. Not to, nobody wants to like be told anything when they're reading a book or be taught something. You know, you're writing a story to engross and to have people, you know, care about. And so, but once those subtle connections get made in the writing, it's fun as a writer to stitch those connections for the reader in subtle ways.
Yeah, yeah. And you did a really nice job of that. I mean, there was never a moment where I felt like you were talking at me. I was definitely engrossed in the lives of these characters. And, you know, and it was fast paced in the fact that, you know, we would drop into a scene and then into another scene and then we're back to the scene, but not necessarily from the perspective of that character.
Right.
You know, that it might be, you would finish that story through the perspective, maybe more honestly, of a different character. And I really enjoyed that. Honestly, that ride, you know, this book reads so, you know, you don't want to hear people say, I read your book in one day, right? But I mean, it reads so.
No, I do.
I did. I literally read it in one day because you know, I love being immersed in the lives of characters that are so rich like this, that if you take time away from it, maybe you have the opportunity to really think about the situation and the characters. But with this, I couldn't, because there's so many times where I'm like, I need to know what happens. I need to see, you know, how this is going to resolve. So it was beautifully written.
Okay.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, it's such a good book. I think one of the reasons I enjoy literary fiction is this idea that, you know, in a lot of other genres, you have a protagonist and an antagonist, typically human. And in this book, I mean, the antagonist, it almost seems like it's, you know, maybe the past or the truth. Were you thinking along the lines of, you know, how an antagonist would come into play when you were working through these characters?
No, I mean, I think I just had faith that like there would be that their stories would sort of create a center of gravity enough to, you know, you know, the three, you know, they're all the central characters in my mind at one, you know, but those three women really, you know, just thinking about what their circumstances, they were each born into a very different circumstance, and they navigate them to the best of their ability. And so I think it's and each one of them has, like, you know, obstacles and disappointments and pain that they have to move through and evolve from or not. And so it's really just kind of like life itself is is, you know, what challenges us, you know. That's and so these are just three lives. It's, you know, three girls who grew up, you know, at the end of a long, you know, dirt road, you know, far from the center of a town, and the trajectories of each of them were very, very different from each other.
You know, I feel like, for the benefit of our viewers and our listeners, I'd like to bring Lupita into the conversation, because we've talked a lot about Dana and we've talked a lot about Jackie, but what about Lupita? Where did she come from, and how did she take shape as you were writing this book?
Lupita came into view, like really like into view at sort of like a apparition, because so Jackie was the original like character, and then, you know, I sort of had placed her at the end of this long road, and in this kind of perfectly nice, you know, ranch house. But just down the road from her is this old, important, you know, sort of mansion that was built in the 1800s and has been owned by the same family since then. And the current people who own it live in New York and come up on the weekends and sometimes in the summer. And so the two girls are the same age, which is, even though they come from very different circumstances, they're the only two girls the same age at the end of this long road. So they become friends. And so it was their friendship, and, you know, was what I was writing. And there's an activity that they do where they pick stones from the river and pretend that they've been enchanted by these sort of fairies. And they're actually jewels that are being disguised as stone. So it's their like sort of childhood project. And
Right.
And I was writing a description of them doing that, and I imagined this girl like sort of
Watching.
watching and excluded. And she became the daughter of the caretaker, who is somebody who came into the United States from Mexico when his daughter was an infant, and then his wife and two daughters follow and meet him in Florida, and then there's this opportunity to work for this family up in New York, and who eventually end up sponsoring them to citizenship. And so this family sort of moves from Florida up to New York, but the circumstance is particular in the sense that the father has to live sort of at this house in Connecticut and serve as the caretaker, and the mother serves as the maid who sort of oversees the apartment in the city, and her older daughter works there with her. So the family is split by this kind of employment and by this amazing opportunity to be like sponsored for citizenship. So already you can see like the power dynamic there, and also just like looking at a family that's like, and I know families in my own life that have had to make like hard decisions about like where the job is and who's going to school where, and they sort of they cope, and so in this case it's like, here's this young girl who's living with her father above a garage working for this very wealthy family, and then these two girls who are a year older than she is and who want nothing to do with her. And so she's already sort of a stranger in a strange land, but then she's sort of snubbed by them, and she's the only Spanish speaking girl in this very small white town, and certainly the only one from Mexico, and there's just an enormous gulf between her experience and the kids, and she experiences bullying and racism, and so both subtle and not subtle, and so she became sort of the third of these three characters for me.
I feel like her importance, there's so many levels to it. It's sort of like peeling an onion, right? But without her, I don't know that we would have seen the depths of Jackie and Dana, right? This idea that they wouldn't just include her, to me is like inexplicable. And my heart broke for Lupita so many times, but it really helped add to who Jackie is and who Dana is. These two people who are also making it in life, but don't have the capacity to see what they're doing. The triangulation of that was really, really well done. And we're coming to the end. So I do want to ask you if you have another book in you that we can look forward to.
Well, I'm working on one right now that takes place in the same fictional town, which is,
Wells.
As Wells, but it's very close to the town I grew up in. And I'm working through one last sort of chunk of unresolved baggage, I guess. But there's a family in that town that is sort of the center strut of the town. They're the volunteer firemen, and they but they're also the loudest at the picnics, and they've been in the town for generations, and they're modeled off sort of families that I knew growing up who have grown up in these and lived for generations in these small towns. But are sort of slightly getting like nudged out year by year, like as these towns become more gentrified and wealthier. And so they sort of hover at the edge of both of the main storylines in the two books, but in the third book, they're going to be the center of the book.
Awesome.
In particular one character. Yeah. So
awesome.
that will end that trilogy of Wells, Connecticut, hopefully.
That's wonderful. Well, or hopefully not. I got to ask you one more thing before Julie takes you away. When you're writing, do you have that moment of doubt where like, is anyone going to want to read this book?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Really? Okay.
John, I mean, it's more than, I mean, it's a lot worse than that, actually. Like it's not just like, will anybody want to read it? It's just, there's just, yeah, I think I've never met a writer who hasn't had that moment of mortification. That like,
what am I doing? Yeah.
Yeah, I've been in this years and it's nothing, like, or it's worse than nothing. And so, yeah, I think it's part of the process.
Well, how do you get through those moments?
You just remember the last time you had one, it's like, and
yeah.
And also, I'm lucky in the sense that my day job is I'm a literary agent, so I work with writers, great writers, and even the greatest writers that I work with, I know are plagued with like self-doubt, and so knowing that they're capable of what they've produced, and also sort of been kind of at the foot of the stage as they really grapple with whether something is worth publishing or not. I take comfort in that. It gives me some sort of solace, but it's not easy. Writing's lonely, and because you're, particularly with fiction, where you're creating every single detail, every aspect of it. If you're not bumping into some kind of self-doubt along the way, then you may be a sociopath. But I just haven't met that writer who hasn't been crippled by that at some point.
Well, thank you for working through any doubts that you have ever had. I enjoyed your book immensely, and thanks for this conversation. And just to remind everyone, The End of the Day is out in bookstores now. Buy it at Warwick's if you can, but any boutique bookstore, as Julie said, your dollars are like votes, so that we get to see the third book. And I'll pass it back to you, Julie.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a great conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and when you guys were talking about, the style and how you write, Bill, what I love and I've always loved about your writing is you assume your readers are smart.
Truly.
And
that's a good point.
And it's like, and that's what I love, is because we have to think. And we have to keep track, and that's what I love about your books. It's just so that's just my little personal stuff about why I love you. But we also have Pat Jackson, who's out there watching us right now. Oh, Clegg, I'm sorry. And so she also loves every book that you've read. I mean, that you've written, and she can't wait to read this one. But she has a question of, you are such a good writer. I'm wondering which authors you read.
As many as I can. And I will say I've, because my job is reading as a literary agent, and I'm always behind. So especially during a pandemic where writers have been wildly prolific. So I've actually, I struggle to read just for pleasure. And the great solution for me has become audiobooks. So I'm always listening to an audiobook when I'm working out or going for a walk. And recently there've been a few that have just been extraordinary. If the book that I recommend to people a lot right now is City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert.
Oh yeah.
Which is, did you read it, Julie?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Oh my God. I have to say, I think it's just one of the best books of the last decade. It's and it presents as sort of fizzy and light, maybe, but I mean,
not,
yeah. Somebody said, "Well, what's it about?" And I was like, "It's sort of about everything, honestly. It's about the
I mean, because if you talk about the time period, some people go, and it's like, no. Yeah.
But it's about aging. It's about it's about the evolution of it's really like a kind of an alternative history of women over the back half of the last century, like a true history of the experience of being a woman in New York in any case, and how New York has changed, and how theater has changed, how the economy has changed, the impact of war. I loved it. I was devastated that it was over. I didn't want it to end.
And she's fantastic. I mean, Liz Gilbert is just whether she's writing fiction or nonfiction,
You've had her to the store?
We've had her, yeah. We've had her a couple. We've been really lucky that we have had the opportunity to host her, because we fill a nice size theater for her, and she's got fantastic fans too. So
yes. But I think a lot of people think of her as a commercial writer because of Eat, Pray, Love. But she started out as an award-winning short story writer, and she's written several nonfiction books. One is The Last American Man, I think it's called. which I haven't read, but she's a really serious writer. There's
and her fiction writing, I can't remember, what was the botanist one? I can't remember what that one was. But anyways, all those something things. All
I haven't read it yet.
Anyways,
because I just finished City of Girls a little bit ago. But
but she's a great writer.
So I just try to read what I can, and I read Michelle Obama's memoir, I'm rereading Edmund White's A Boy's Own Story, that novel. I represent Ed, and I haven't read that book since I was like 17 years old. So I'm having
wow,
kind of a
that's cool
right now. Yeah. So yeah, I just kind of, and I read a lot of poetry for pleasure because there's an economy of time with that. I can actually read a suite of poems and have kind of a full experience with an author and their consciousness, and in between like all the other stuff that I have to do. So poetry I read a lot of. And
I think the poetry's gotten a resurgence, especially during COVID. I think people have really gravitated towards it as a solace, and as something that is just, we've sold a lot more poetry these last few months.
That's great. That's good news. I mean, that's one of the best pieces of news I've heard in a while. Yeah, I do. I read a lot of poets, and I read the same poets again and again, and very rarely do I wedge somebody new in. But yeah. So that
brings up another good point about, and we're talking Liz Gilbert, who writes fiction and nonfiction, and you've written fiction and nonfiction. Do you have a preference of the two?
For reading? I mean, or writing?
No, or for writing. For you personally, writing.
I wrote since after I wrote the second memoir, 90 Days, I think I finished writing that in 2012 or 2011 and I hadn't written anything in the form of like memoir or personal essay until this spring. I wrote an essay for Vogue, and like it was the first time I'd really done that, and it was a certain kind of writing that I didn't think I would go back to, and I really liked it. I mean, and maybe because it's a way of puzzling through things that have happened in your life and kind of putting things in perspective, and there's just a different kind of satisfaction from that. So, but fiction is more fun. Like, I mean, in terms of writing those memoirs, which involve a lot of,
emotion,
a lot of hard,
and, a lot of stuff. Like it's tough stuff. But for me, like, even though my books have a lot of hard things that happen in them, because there's nobody there, I'm not trying to work within the parameters of anything that actually happened. It's like there's something joyful about it. There's an exhilaration about creating new things. So I really enjoy, and I expect to until I run out of ideas. I mean, I love being able to steal away for a week, or a weekend. It's hard when you have a kid.
Well, that was my next question to you, because I mean, you are a busy guy, not only with the literary, but you're, writer, family, the whole bit. So when do you write every day? Do you carve out, what's your writing process?
I don't. So it's particularly in the generative period, like in this case, the generative period was probably 4 years, like where I was just kind of writing it and kind of letting myself go wide before really imposing order. And that I kind of need to be sort of alone, and I need a chunk of time. It can be a weekend or a week. And oftentimes what I'll do is I'll come up to our house from, we live in New York, and we have this house, which is 90 minutes north along the Hudson, in the Hudson River Valley. And I'll wake up super early at like 5:30 and write till 2, and then like work for a few hours and return emails, and just in a very compressed time, like show up to my job at the agency, and then, return phone calls through the afternoon, and then write till like midnight. And so sometimes I don't even tell people that I've left. I'll just, they just won't hear back from me until 2:00 that day. Nice. But there can be months between those periods of time. Often there are. And so even though I don't write in between, I have a lot of faith in the unconscious. So I feel like, I'll be very immersed in something, and it's always kind of like hovering sort of at the edge of stuff. And so usually when I sit down to write, like I just have access to a lot more than I think I will, and because it's been churning, and I actually in a way it's a method that I wouldn't, if I wouldn't want like to just be a writer and have like unending amounts of time to just write, because I think stepping away and getting perspective from it and letting it kind of stew a bit before like going back to it has helped me a lot. So,
but also keeping track. I mean, that has to be a little bit though. I mean, keeping track of it, because your novels are very complicated, and so it's like you've got to like really keep track of stuff.
I write out kind of family trees and timelines.
Okay.
I have so many graphs and so many, like, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And still, like, my editor Wendy, I mean, it's embarrassing, but like late in the process, like when after I've finally given her like a full draft of it, you know, I had changed certain things that, you know, and because certain things couldn't happen before 1969, and I didn't, and then I decided later I didn't want somebody to be this age. And so I would make those changes, but any change you make late, like, has a ripple effect through. And so she'd be like, this doesn't quite, you know, we would, so that was always kind of a shock when like my charts and my graphs like were failing me. So.
And I think people are always, I mean, because we do a lot of these events and people are very interested, people are watching, or they're really interested in what authors' processes are. And you're so involved in so many different aspects of this industry that it's really interesting to hear your perspective on stuff. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we have taken up enough of your time. So I'm going to, Jennifer, tell us real quick, if people are watching that want to find out more about you, where's the best place to find you on any social media or anything?
Okay, well, you can find me at Jennifer Grace on Twitter, and you can also follow the Premise podcast and listen to this one at SanDiegoWritersFestival.com.
Excellent, thank you. And Bill, do you even have time to get on any social media? Do you even want to?
I take pictures of donuts, like
Nice.
I'm on an Instagram account.
Hopefully you eat them
I
too.
take pictures of donuts and occasionally like things around like outside the house, but like it's a very narrow Instagram account. Like, it's like,
I like it though. That's a really interesting thing into your psyche there, that it's pictures of donuts. I love that.
I love donuts. We have, like, my husband and our about to be 6-year-old girl, we have a donut party like every weekend, and so there's a few places that we go, and if I travel, I get the tips and find out what the donuts are. So
Nice.
Fantastic. So is it just Bill Clegg on Instagram?
I think it's called Clegg 77. Yeah.
Okay. Well, well, we may find some more followers that are looking at those donuts, man.
Like donuts. Yeah.
Have you had Voodoo Donuts in Portland?
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely.
Of course.
Yeah, Voodoo's great. There's a couple. There's a few in Portland. What's the name of the one? And there's another one in Portland that's incredible.
Oh.
It's called Blue. Somebody out there will know, but
Somebody out there will know.
Yeah, but there's Portland's a good donut town. Seattle is a good donut town too.
I was going to let you go, but then I just remembered something. What made you put La Jolla in the book?
Yeah, I was going to ask that.
Well, because I used to come to California I had an aunt and uncle who lived in Poway. And so I would come out to Poway and we would go to the beach in La Jolla. And I remember coming to La Jolla a bunch of times, like just kind of growing up and just thinking it was like one of the great places. And so, so when I imagined places where Dana would like, it was like, of course, like La Jolla.
Love it.
Yeah.
Love that. So well, with that, I'm going to take us off of Facebook. So everybody out there watching, thank you. This is recorded. You can rewatch it. If you joined us late, you can see it from the beginning. Order Bill's book. We love it. We could have had a whole other conversation on it. Did you ever have a family? Because that is just spot on fantastic. It's still, I think, on our bestseller table. I mean, we adore that book. So
nice.
Anyways, the end of the day, Bill Clegg, thank you.
Great to see you, Julie.
Good seeing you too. Thank you, Jennifer. So we are off of Facebook, and we will